Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels, still in print. When did it come out? 2006. Still going strong. You can buy it on the cheap. Maybe not so much on the cheap. It should be cheap, but there you go. It'll be out there somewhere. What else can we say? The voice of SF Experience on YouTube, 40 years in the book trade as an insider. So today we're going to do a top 12 PKD, Philip K. Dick, because a while ago I did a worst of Philip K. Dick. So I guess this is kind of a best of. And what I wanted to do with this was really not make it too subjective. I've put a few of my favourites in, but I decided to put the list together by looking at the books which come up quite a lot with PKD fans and with academic studies and serious criticism of Dick's work. So there's a few favourites in here, and I'm ranking them from 12 to 1. And this isn't so much in order of importance. In some ways, I've grouped some together for different reasons. It'll all come out in the wash and you'll see. I've made number 1 a personal favourite, but it is one that tends to sort of pop up highly. So this is semi-subjective, semi-objective. And I'm going to show you some PK editions as we go. Those of you who've watched the channel many times will have seen most of these books before. But having done a worst of, I kind of thought we should do a best of, because of course Philip K. Dick, born prematurely in 1928, died in 1982, so he was only in his early 50s. Probably the most influential American science fiction writer of the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. He didn't sell as many books as people like Asimov, Heinlein, what have you, but his influence grew steadily after the release of the film Blade Runner, based on his book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which everybody knows about. And then the mainstream discovered him, realised that he was good. And of course, from there, a whole PKD industry has grown up. And it's a great shame he never got to see it, because he was a man who wanted success in his lifetime, as you'll discover if you ever read his selected letters. And really, this is by way of an introduction as well. He's got a very big oeuvre. It's very hard to know when to start. So I'm going to make some suggestions throughout this. And I would say that if you were going to read just a dozen novels by PKD, these would be the ones that I would choose as well, speaking subjectively as well as objectively. One thing I'm not going to cover is his mainstream novels. There is a video on the channel about them called Meatballs on Main Street. This is my favourite, Puttering About in a Small Land. And recently the very wonderful Scott Bradfield, the Old Master Bather, has done a video about this, and he loved it as well. So we're not going to talk about that. So the mainstream novels are covered in depth elsewhere on the channel. There's other PKD videos as well, looking at specific books. So without further ado, we begin with number 12, and at number 12 I've picked a book which I think is the best entry point for new Dick heads to come into the arena of Dickian studies. This is his best early novel. I think the consensus is that it's his best early novel, and by that I mean his SF novels of the late 1950s, and this is Time Out of Joint, in a lovely old Penguin edition, which I bought new back in the mid-80s. And Time Out of Joint was published when? Is it 1959? Let's have a look. It's published in 1959 by Lippincott. And there is another version of this book, which is called Confessions of a Crap Artist, which is a mainstream novel. It has much the same plot up to a certain point, so that's well worth checking out. And that was the only one of Dick's mainstream novels published in his lifetime, and I cover that in the other video. So, Time Out of Joint. What can we say about it? Well, first of all, people noticed when the film The Truman Show came out that it appeared to be, to a degree, influenced or based upon this book. And the basic storyline is this. The central character is a guy called Regal Gum, and he basically does a puzzle every day in his newspaper, which is called something like Spot the Little Green Man. And he wins every single day, and he hangs out in his, I think it's his brother or his sister's house, and he sort of has a dalliance with the next door neighbour's wife. So this appears like a mainstream novel set in late 50s America, and of course Dick lived in California, so there's a lot of great coverage of that part of American life in California, which was a hotbed of radicalism, and still is, I guess. And the good thing about this is that What Gum seems to realise is he seems to realise there is more to the world than what he thinks, and reality was a big thing for Philip K. Dick, and perception is one of his major themes, arguably his major theme, the question, what is real? And he begins to realise that there is something else going on, and he begins to experience these strange shifts of reality as things which seem to be real suddenly turn into pieces of paper. Like, for example, there's a soft drink stand which suddenly is replaced by a piece of paper that says soft drink stand, and there is something else going on, and it transpires that Regal Gum is far more important as the winner of this game than anybody ever realised. And it's a really good read. It's a very smooth read. It's easily his most professionally written book, and it becomes full-blown SF the further it goes on, and it's a great entry point for anybody who reads general fiction or SF to get into the great man's work. And I absolutely love it. I think it's an absolute classic, and I think more and more people feel that way, and if anything, it's kind of underrated. So Time Out of Joint, a really good place to start. I'm going to pop it on the podium there. If you're wondering what all this stuff is, I'm off to Dorset Bob soon to swap some books up and do a book haul. There is a certain mythology around the channel. I'm not going to tell you who Dorset Bob is. If you look on the channel page and look at the playlists and the other SF videos, you will see dealer visit warehouses where I visit some of the UK's biggest SF book dealers. Those are worth a look if you're new to the channel. If you are new to the channel, thanks for subscribing. It's great to see you and great to have you on board. So that's a great entry level. I am a firm believer to a degree in a approach to reading writers which is chronological. Start with the early works and read forward. Of course, in the real world and real life, we rarely do that. We often end up just picking up a book at random and going from there. We don't do the preparatory work beforehand. So this is to help you with this. The next three books are generally regarded as lighter works, and they're works which I'm very fond of. And I wanted to put them in because some of the books which are considered as minor, which are quite funny and quirky and have all sorts of wonderful tropes in them, are ones which often fall by the wayside. And I'm going to begin with number 11, and this is a book called Clans of the Alphane Moon. This is a late 70s Dell edition, very beautiful, I think you'll agree. And it's got blue-tealed text block. I think tealed is actually the correct word. I came across that the other day because none of us seem to know, and it's happening more and more with British books these days. It used to happen with American paperbacks all the time. So that's Clans of the Alphane Moon, and I'll show you a really nice copy, which I say really nice, the spine's really faded now. This is my original, which I bought back in the 80s when I was first reading PKD, Clans of the Alphane Moon. And Clans of the Alphane Moon is a very funny book, and it's got this wonderful blurb on the back, which I can never help repeating when I'm asked to describe it. And it says that Chuck Rittersdorf, a 21st century CIA robot programmer, decides to kill his wife by remote control. Don't they all? He enlists the aid of a telepathic Ganymedian slime mold called the Lord Running Clam, an attractive female policewoman, and various others. But what happens is he gets embroiled in this interplanetary spy ring, which is connected to this colony of people living on the Alphane Moon, human beings who have become exiled from Earth because they have all sorts of mental health issues. And it's one of the first books to tackle that. It's very funny. The Lord Running Clam is one of the most memorable, silly aliens in the history of science fiction. And he is played for laughs. You know, and Dick was quite happy to attack the bourgeois aspects of science fiction, the tropes, the things which people regard as sacred, and kind of turn them on their head. And he does this very well in this, and it's a very funny book. And it wasn't until I read a book by Emma Newman a few years ago called, it's her first novel in the Atlas sequence, which I can't remember the title of now, Planetfall, which is a great book. And she tackles one of the things that Dick tackled in the 60s. And of course, she's doing that decades later and later on. So PKD was a real innovator as well. This is a really good fun book. I really recommend it. So do check it out, Clans of the Alphane Moon. And such a pure SF null title you will not find. That was one of the beauties of PKD. Some of the books I'm covering in this part were very funny, and he wasn't afraid to have fun. And the humorous aspect of his work is often neglected, I think, by critics who want people to take him more seriously these days. But, you know, you could take your pleasure seriously. That's the whole thing. So next, I'm going to recommend a book which I'm very fond of, which a lot of people seem to think is one of his worst books. There is a video on the channel devoted just to this book. I'll try and put a link in. And I think it's massively underrated. And that's the very wonderful Our Friends from Frolix 8. This is the 80s Granada edition with a wonderful Jim Burns jacket. And Our Friends from Frolix 8, which he nearly dropped. Again, as I say, people seem to think that it's a very average book. I think it's a very important one. It has some serious themes about the future where there's a dystopian society which is ruled by people with psi powers, and how the little man without psi powers is ground down under the heel of these people who have become rather too powerful and rather too full of themselves. It also shows the distinct influence of A. Van Vogt, who is Philip K. Dick's hero. And Van Vogt would do these really sort of wild things, and Dick did wild things as well in his writing and sort of broke rules, and that was good. Now, this is the Kinnell UK hardcover edition of Our Friends from Frolix 8. This is the UK first hardcover, and this has got wonderful wraparound artwork by Keith Roberts, the English science fiction writer who was kind of the Thomas Hardy of SF. What about the story, I hear you ask? Well, in Our Friends from Frolix 8, you have, as I say, this cadre of telepaths and psi-powered people who are far more intelligent than the ordinary man in the street. And the regular man in the street is one of Dick's sort of heroes. And he really sort of was a champion of the ordinary guy, the regular guy who got up in the morning, went to a cruddy job and had a rough time. And, you know, it begins with one of these people who's called Nick taking his son to have an intelligence test. And if you fail this intelligence test, you will never become a new man. You will never become one of the psi people. And you're sort of condemned to be in the underclass, really. So it is quite a sort of interesting thing. Now, there's a backstory where a guy called Thors Pravoni has gone off in a spaceship to try and find help from other worlds, to enlist aliens to help man overturn the mutants on Earth. So it's a sort of anti-evolutionary thing, really. It's kind of a devolutionary thing. But it says some very profound things about religion and belief, and particularly about being humble and, you know, not sort of looking down on people. And I think it's a wonderful, warm-hearted book. And it has flashes of poetry, and it does have its funny moments as well. And I really like Our Friends from Frolix 8. I think it bears closer examination. Dick wrote very quickly at times. He often took amphetamines so he could write all night. His work is uneven in terms of stylistic quality, and that's often aimed at this. But I think Frolix 8 transcends those things, and I think it has a real gonzo charm all of its own. I think it's a wonderful book. Do watch the other video, and you'll see why, because I talk about it more. Then, one of my early favourites with PKD, a book which I bought early on in my reading career. I think the first one I read was Androids, then I read Martian Time Slip, and then probably this one, and then Counterclock World, which doesn't come up in this. I'll do something about Counterclock World one day, because it's an interesting book. Was this book, Galactic Pot Healer. Now, what a title, Galactic Pot Healer. What does that mean? It sort of combines these sort of silly cliches. Like, you'll get this a lot. People who don't know much about science fiction will say, oh, you know, intergalactic adventures, or what have you, or galactic this, galactic that. Galactic Pot Healer, a book about somebody who heals ceramics, who takes broken pots and puts them back together. And this is the Pan Lozenge edition. And I cover this in a video on the channel about conceptual breakthrough. And I've got very vivid memories of walking into a university campus to the bookshop to buy this when I was still a schoolboy. And it was very exciting to buy this new. And this was the first adult book that I read in one sitting. So it's really important to me. So Galactic Pot Healer, what can we say about it? It's set in a future where there's massive unemployment on Earth. And the central character, who's called Joe Fernwright, is it Joe Fernwright? Yeah, Joe Fernwright. And he is really, he's got this very specialised job, and nobody's really interested in anymore in ceramics. So he's out of work naturally, as his own studio. And he goes on to sign on the dole, on the unemployment benefit, every day. And he also plays this game. But he gets embroiled in this scheme that this being on another planet has. This being is called the Glimmer, and it's very large and almost godlike. And it has this plan to raise a cathedral which is sunk to the bottom of an ocean back to the surface and to restore it. And because Fernwright is an expert in ceramics, he's one of the people who is recruited to do this. And it's got a lot of metaphysics in it. There's a lot more to it. It's a very witty story. It cracks along. It's very funny. And this is the Galactic hardcover UK first edition. I do love the Galactic yellow. It's absolutely fantastic. And it has an absolutely marvellous ending, which wrong-foots your expectations. And it does that so beautifully. I regard it as one of the great examples of the conceptual breakthrough in SF. And it's just a wonderful read. It's a charming, funny book, and it takes a lot of the tropes of SF and it sort of pokes gentle fun at them. And, you know, his inventiveness in it is wonderful. And I say, I read it in one sitting and I was about 15, I think. I just burned through it. It's just such a great book. So there's a few of the lighter books to get you further into P80. And now we get on to more of the dark stuff. Now, I will say the next book is not one of my favourites. It comes up a lot on people's sort of favourite list of PKD. It is a very important book because it shows him at a sort of crossroads in his career. For a period of time between around about 1970 and 1974, Dick produced very little and published very little. Then he started off with a book called, or restarted off with a book called Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, which is more like his 60s work, but showing some evolution. In the 60s, he produced a heck of a lot of books and short stories. He really went for it. And he entered a very dark phase. He met his final partner. He started having all sorts of mystical and religious revelations. He'd been involved more with the drug culture as it became more and more of a thing in California. And, you know, it's fair to say there was a certain amount of drug abuse going on in his life and in the people around him. And the result of that was this book, A Scanner Darkly. And this isn't one I go back to very often. It's not that I don't like the dark stuff. I do like dark books, but I do find this quite grim, and that's a reason you should read it. And the basic idea of Scanner Darkly, there is a film by Richard Linklater, which is rotoscope animation. Animation is not my thing, but it is a good film. And fundamentally, you've got near future America where there's an undercover narcotics agent called Bob Arctor. Is it Bob Arctor? Yeah. And he is kind of spying on people who, you know, are deemed to be subversive. But actually, he is, you know, he's given a new assignment and he has to spy on himself because he has an undercover identity. He has an agent identity and he has a black ops identity. He has to sort of spy on himself. And that's typical of the kind of paranoid themes that you get in PKD. And he does say, I think there's a foreword I seem to remember. Is it? No, he wrote somewhere about how basically he saw people really falling apart under the influence of drugs, and some of them died. And this was a kind of homage to them. And it is a very black, bleak book. As a drug-induced dystopia and piece of paranoid SF, it ranks up there with the best of William S. Burroughs. And it really is sort of a stepping stone, because at that point in the 70s, Dick's work took interesting turns further into philosophy and religion and metaphysics. And I think I'll do something in the future about that later phase. So that later phase is the phase that the mainstream critics, when Dick was discovered after Blade Runner, they really sort of light on this period and they took his religious experiences, some of the things which could have been hallucinations, and his paranoia. He was very paranoid about the FBI and the CIA, and he denounced the science fiction writer Thomas M. Dish to the FBI, amongst other things. And it was quite a dark and strange period, but it was also the period in which he started to get some critical acclaim outside of the SF magazines, which he'd always had. So this is an important one. The film is good, it's fairly faithful, but it doesn't quite get the black tone of the book. This is arguably his most grim book of all, his most dystopian, and it is really powerful and fantastic, but it's not one of my favourites personally, though I am due for a reread, it has to be said. So, moving on, we come on to a book which, I did a video about this as well, which was one of the early books I read by Dick, and it is different to a lot of the others. The narrative is more focused, more coherent. There are less characters, I would say, than the average Dick book. He was very good at sort of ensemble cast. We had an awful lot of characters and lots of subplots. This is a little bit more focused. And you could say it's a utopian novel. And this is Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb. And this is one of those books that generally the hardcore Dick heads sort of whisper about to each other. And it is an absolutely amazing book, and I reread it last year for the first time in many years. And it concerns a small town, and it's before an atomic war. So there's a part before an atomic war and a part after, and afterwards you're in the post-apocalyptic bit, and things have gone a little bit sort of haywire, as you can expect. And there is somebody up in this little spaceship you see on the cover, which is orbiting the Earth. And I don't really want to talk about it too much, because there's a sort of mutant character in this who normally, in the sort of narratives we get today, the identity politics narratives of today, would be somebody there'd be a lot of sympathy for. But he's actually a really bad character. He would have been described years ago as disabled. Now he'd be physically challenged. I mean, he's quite a malign character. And obviously there's a reference to the Kubrick film there, which of course was based on the novel Red Alert by Peter George. And this is a good one. It's a really good one. It's often missing from the lists and what have you, but it is one the Dick fans go for. And it's got a really humane side. You see flashes of the kind of work that he did in his mainstream novels, which were written in the 1950s and mostly not published until much, much later. So it's a good blend. So in a way, it has affinities to me with Time Out of Joint, because it is something that somebody who isn't so immersed in pure sci-fi would be more likely to pick up. And it's a really good book. So that's Dr. Bloodmoney. Really recommend that one. Pop it there on the podium. Then, controversially, I've put this quite low in my ranking, because this is one of the books that's regarded usually as one of his top novels, and by many people as the top novel. Again, it's a very dark book. It's one that I don't love as much as some of the others. That's largely because I don't actually think it's as good as a lot of his books. I think it's brilliant, but I don't think it's as good as some of the others. It's not that it isn't brilliant, it's just that some of the others are underrated. And that's the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. One thing that's worth pointing out is that in the mid-90s, this was out of print. And the bookselling company I worked for then, we did a special edition. We commissioned a special edition because it was out of print and it was exclusive to our shops. And that sort of tells you how far it had fallen from grace. And this is, you know, within 15 years of Blade Runner coming out, and Dick's work all came back into print and the unpublished books came into print. Now, Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch is an expansion of the short story The Days of Perky Pat. And this is one of Dick's Martian novels. In Blade Runner, you will have seen the moments when there are advertisements saying, you know, move to the off-world colonies, everything's going to be great, they're fantastic. But the off-world colonies are basically Mars in the Dickian universe. And fundamentally, there isn't a common background to Dick's novels. The connections are more web-like, as Brian Aldiss pointed out. But something that he did cite on is that Mars would become a colony. And of course, that's understandable, it's nearby. So, you know, you get elements of that in people like the work of Barry L. Malzberg, D.G. Compton. I mean, how many people have done colonial books on Mars? Loads and loads and loads. One of my favourites is Frontera by Lewis Shiner, which I've mentioned quite a few times on the channel. But in this, there are people who've gone to Mars to colonise, and it's a very, very grim existence. And it's so grim that they tend to get involved to escape from the horror of it in a game involving a doll called Perky Pat. And it's a combination of a board game and a virtual reality thing. So you have little sort of doll figures and little houses and what have you, but you have to take this drug called Candy. So you enter this hallucinatory world. So it's like an early virtual reality thing. And of course, it being a drug thing, it ties in with the 60s and what have you. This is a late 60s book. And there is a character called Palmer Eldritch who has been in outer space, and he claims to have a better hallucinogen, which is called Chew-Z. Unfortunately, Chew-Z is incredibly powerful, and it plunges the users into a horrific world where Palmer Eldritch reigns supreme. And is Palmer Eldritch actually a human being? Has he been taken over by an alien? There's all sorts of subplots. It's a very, very black book. And again, when I read it and reread it, I think about the Nova series by William Burroughs. And it really is quite something. And it's not, as I say, it's not that I don't like Dick's dark books, but I don't often find them as good as his things which are leavened with a little bit more humour. But it is very profound, and it covers, you know, all his usual subjects: the nature of reality, religion, class and capitalism, man and machine, dark-haired girls and drugs. They're pretty much all in there in Palmer Eldritch. But for me, it's not a favourite one. It's a book I admire rather than love. Again, I'm due for a reread because it's been a few years, but it is one that sort of ranks high objectively in the Dickian scheme of things and the fan bases out there, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. So it's about time we move Galactic Popular, and we'll just pop it there. Then we come to, controversially, I'm going to do one of his most famous books at number 5, and that's because it's an experimental novel. I think it's a brilliant novel. It broke the mould as far as novels do, but it isn't always one I enjoy as much as some of the other ones, and that's the incredibly famous and brilliant The Man in the High Castle. This is the first edition, and there's a little postcard there from the Penguin postcard set. And The Man in the High Castle, of course, you've probably heard of, is the alternate history novel, a Hitler wins novel. And usually it's ranked alongside Keith Roberts' Pavan as being the finest alternative history novel of all time. And of course, in this book, you've probably heard of it, but we'll just recap briefly. America has been conquered by the Axis. The Axis have taken over all of Europe. They've taken all of Africa, and they're doing all sorts of interesting things there. This is the Berkeley paperback, which was the first copy I bought. I've got about 4 copies. And I bought this from a bookshop called Forever People in Bristol. I used to travel down from South Wales to Bristol, which is not far from where I live now, just to buy things. And I think I got it there, and that was my first reading of it, because it was out of print at that point in the UK. And so the Axis have divided up America between them. The Japanese have California and the sort of southeast, as it were, southwest, I should say, and the Nazis have the West. And there is a certain sort of subplot about the jockeying between those two different powers. But it really centers on ordinary people living in California under Japanese occupation, particularly a couple who decide to start their own business. They've normally been trading in Americana. Colonial Japanese who've come over to live in California are obsessed with collecting authentic American articles, Mickey Mouse watches, those sort of things. And a chap has this business where he sells those things. But he wants to start authentic American folk art. And he and his wife start making this jewellery. And this is based on a thing that happened in Dick's own life with one of his wives, where she wanted to make jewellery and sell it. And he was sort of pressed into service on that. Also, it's about Taoism. And Dick wrote the novel in a very, very unconventional way. You can use little coins to toss. It's Taoism. You use the I Ching, which is a form of divination, a way of foretelling what you should do or what the future will be. And you can take yarrow stalks and toss them, and they go into a shape called a hexagram, and from that you've got to interpret it. And he actually plotted the novel using that means. So it does tend to go in unusual directions, but that's life. Life is like that. There's a lot of contingency, existential angst, and things go in unexpected directions. And really, at the centre of the book, there's an enigma, which is about a writer called Hawthorne Abdenson, who whenever I try and visualise, I see Philip K. Dick himself. And he has written a book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. And it's a science fiction novel, and it's set in a world where the Axis didn't win World War II. And there's a climax where one of the characters confronts Abdenson at his high castle, which is where he lives in the mountains. And of course, he's wanted by the Nazis, particularly. The Japanese are a little bit more cool about things. And it has a wonderful ending. And the last line or two, where one of the characters realizes what's actually going on in reality, is profound stuff. And I think a lot of people don't get it. There's different ways of interpreting it. I know the way I interpret it, but I'm not going to tell you because it would be a spoiler. But it says something about metafiction, fiction about fiction, the nature of reality and the nature of fiction. And it is a great book. The Amazon TV series, forget it. You don't want to go there. It's nothing like it. This is much, much better. It is a philosophical novel. It's full of interesting questions. It wrong-foots you. And it won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. And I think it was 62, 61, 62. Dick never won another big award because his work was very uneven. But this really was a step forward. And I think Ursula Le Guin She wrote an essay about this in which she said that the great thing about it was that Mr. Tagomi, who's one of the Japanese characters, was the first Mrs. Brown in science fiction, the first truly ordinary people, person. He wasn't, a square-jawed hero. He was an ordinary guy just living. And that's the beauty of Dick's work. He books ordinary people. We look at ordinary people in the future, in alternate histories, in all sorts of strange things, and we see how they cope. And, he's a wonderful, wonderful humanist writer, and this is a great example of that, The Man in the High Castle. Then, oops, that's bad. We shouldn't have done that. That was a mint copy. Oh, well, it is what it is. We learn to cope. Then, next, one of my personal favourites, and this is where things will get a bit controversial. Dick wrote a book called Varlis, Vast Active Living Intelligence System. And Varlis was a very late book, and it's one of a thematic trilogy. There's two other books. There's one called The Divine Invasion. You could say his mainstream novel, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, is part of it. I would say this book, Radio Free Albemuth, is part of it as well. And Varlis really is an examination of Dick's philosophy and religious beliefs. He was a Christian, and he was very interested in early Christianity. And Varlis is the thing, again, that the mainstream critics and hardcore Dick fans often obsess about. Varlis is a fascinating novel. I'm not going to show you a copy. I do have one. I've got a 26 copy lettered, signed limited edition tucked away. But I broke my wrist a while ago and it's behind a load of books there, as I say. So I'm not going to show you that today. I might flash a picture up on the screen. Varlis is a challenging book, an amazing book. But in my view, it's not entirely successful as a work of art. And I do think that to understand Varlis fully, you would better to read the alternate version, which was published after Dick died, which is Radio Free Albemuth. Now, Radio Free Albemuth was made into a film. This is a UK 7-house hardcover first. And it basically fleshes out the plot and is more plot-oriented and really sets out a skeleton for what Varlis is about. And really, this is set in a near-future America where there's a president who's been elected for a third term. He has certain how can we say, certain characteristics which remind you of Richard Nixon. It's an increasingly dystopian society, and there is this satellite going around Earth called Varlis, and is it going to save us? There's more to it than that. I don't want to talk too much about the plot and the book itself, but this is a very exciting science fiction narrative. It's very steely and muscular. The characters are really good. It has the same plot as Varlis. It pares away some of the philosophy and it takes it down just to the story, and it tells it beautifully. And I think it's a really underrated work in Dick's canon. It's an enormously exciting dystopia novel. It is one of my favourite pure dystopias. And you know me, my feeling is that, people talk about dystopia as if it's a separate category to SF. It's not. 90% of genre science fiction after the 1950s is dystopian. It's the background condition. Science fiction was born out of the dystopia and the traveller's tale coming together. That's what proto-SF really is all about for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is really a fast-paced adventure story, a thoughtful one with wonderful characters, and it underpins what Varlis is about. So before you read Varlis, read this, because this will give you something to get hold of, because Varlis is a slippery beast. And as I say, an ambitious novel, but not always a novel which fully achieves, in my view. It's a bit like Delaney. People talk about Darwin, and Darwin is amazing, but it is arguable that maybe Babel 17 and Nova are more finished works of art and possibly more successful in their aims. But then again, that's the nature of experimental writing. That's the nature of doing ambitious things. To a degree, an artist will fail, and any great artist will be inconsistent. That's the thing. So that's Radio Free Albemuth. I rate it really highly. Give it a go if you haven't read it. It's a great, great book. And it's not essentially a bad book to come into as your first PKD. It's very exciting. It's got the 80s feel as well, which is great. So that's Radio Free Albemuth. You'll struggle to find this edition. It's pretty uncommon, actually. And what else do we have then? A real favourite of mine, and a book which it kind of does separate the sheep from the goats. There are different critical opinions about it. Most of the serious critics really rate it. I think it's absolutely superb. And it was the second Dick I read, and I love it, and I've read it many times. and I think it's a superb, superb novel, and that's Martian Time Slip. This is the New English Library UK first edition. There you go, Bruce Pennington illustration on the rear. So I'm going to pop that there so you can feast your eyes on it. Isn't that lovely? They put that on the back cover. It shows you how different things were in those days. You know, commerce wasn't something the publishers were so interested in. It was just about getting the books out there, which was wonderful. But I do have a paperback to hand here. And there we go. So that's Martian Time Slip. And this is, again, a Martian colonial novel. Cast of characters. On Mars, people are living there. There's not a lot of water there. There is a plumbers union leader called Arnie Cott, who's quite an unpleasant guy. And of course, unions in America mean something different to what they do in the UK. And he kind of holds everybody to ransom because he sort of controls the water. And he's a very unpleasant sort of guy. And again, you see the theme in this that comes up in Dick a lot, which is the sort of powerful man and the small man. And there are a number of small sort of characters in this. There's also a race of people who live on Mars who are indigenous called the Bleak Men. And they're very, very reminiscent of Australasian Aboriginals. When I first read this, I kept flashing on that wonderful film Walkabout, based on the novel by James Vance Marshall and David Gulpilil, who played the Aboriginal hunter, and that was so brilliantly. And it's a really, really great story. It is one of his most serious novels. It is, again, ordinary people in the future. And there's a little boy in this, a character called Manfred, who's beautifully depicted. And Manfred is autistic. And when I read this, I was about 15, as I say, I had never heard of autism. And you didn't hear about those things then. Things like autism, ADHD, Asperger's syndrome, they were virtually unknown. So I had to check out what it was. And Manfred is depicted really well. But Manfred has an interesting ability. And there is one chapter in this book where Dick uses that to invoke the time slip, the Martian time slip of the title. And it's something to a degree he drew on a Heinlein story called By His Bootstraps, which is a really famous story. But Dick did it in such a way that when I was reading the book, my head just exploded. And I thought, there's something wrong here. Has the text been missaid? What's going on? And it really, really does pull the rug of reality from under your feet, and you somersault over, and you get that wonderful thing that you only get in great SF of conceptual breakthrough, where a new level of reality is revealed. And this book does that swimmingly halfway through. In most SF, most writers will save that for the end of the book, for the last page, the last paragraph, the last sentence, sometimes the last word. But Dick does it halfway through, and it really does make a big difference. And it's a wonderful, humane book with some abrasive moments in it. And you know, this is real fiction, a real novel. Dick, because of his multi-character approach, wrote real novels with real characters. Some are weaker than others, some are stronger than others. This is one of the strongest ones, Martian Time Slip. I can't say enough good about it. It really is one of the most important Dick novels. Very, very accomplished indeed. Then we're coming down to the last two. And the book at number 2 is one which has always had a fair amount of acclaim, and I think rightly so. It's one of my favourite books by PKD, and that's Ubik. This is the Rap and Witting UK hardcover first. This is my old Granada one I bought back in the 80s. Marvellous stuff with an Ian Robertson jacket there. And Ubik is a fast-paced, thrilling story about people with psi powers. Now, Dick used people with psi powers quite a lot. Van Vogt did it first in Slan. Other people did it first, of course, but Van Vogt brought it into genre SF in a big way. Dick was influenced by Van Vogt. John W. Campbell, editor of Astounding, later Analog, got to a point where he said that, you know, if you were writing a science fiction story, you had to have people with psi powers in it. Dick did a lot of them, and this is about two rival gangs of psis who are competing, and they both have businesses. And one of them, one group has, there are people who can see into the future. One of them can possibly change time. There's all sorts of weird abilities, and there are also people in this who are inertials. They can negate the psi powers of other psi people. So it's quite an interesting thing. Their only power is to negate power. And Dick handles this really well. And it is very fast-paced. And what it reminds me of, rather what reminded me of this, was when I first saw Scanners by David Cronenberg, which is about two groups of rival telepaths. It sort of is rather like this. So this is the philosophical take on Scanners by David Cronenberg. I don't think anybody's head explodes. And there's a wonderful central character called Glenn Runsiter, who is Gene Runsiter, who is the boss of the One Agency. And he is dead, except he's not. He's in Cold Pack. He's in Half-Life. And if you ever see Dark Star by John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon, where the captain is frozen. He's dead, but he's frozen, and they can access his consciousness. That happens in this. And the business is being run by a guy called Joe Chip. And Joe Chip is trying to hold the organisation together as it's attacked by the other psi organisation. And things fall apart very rapidly. Something this book does is a wonderful essay by a critic called Peter Fitting called The Deconstruction of Bourgeois SF. And in that, he refers to the way that Dick will very often lapse into descriptions of what the characters are wearing in this book. And the clothes they wear are absolutely absurd. They all look like clowns. They're ridiculous. And this keeps happening. And this is quite a tense, terse book. And there aren't a lot of direct laughs in it. It is quite grim. But you think, why is he doing this? Why is he doing this thing where there's all these silly things happening? And what Fitting argues is that Dick is undermining the expectations of the genre SF reader by putting these things in and saying, gosh, isn't this absurd? We're using this silly stuff to explore these serious questions about what is real and how can we trust our senses. This happens a lot in Ubik, and it's really, really well managed. So I love this, and it really, really does create something. And that's a poster for it's the Doubleday edition, I think, the US first behind me. And Ubik is presented at the beginning of each chapter with like a mini text, which is an advert for this product. And you think, what is Ubik? Can it do everything? Is it God? How will we find out? How will Joe Chip find out as things fall apart? Very, very much a book about entropy. So it ties in very nicely with British New Wave writing, which was often about entropy and things running down. The second law of thermodynamics, I think it is. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. So that's my number 2. So, number 1. This is where I went entirely with my feelings. I went entirely with how I felt when I first read it, the number of times I've read it since. It's an obvious choice. I'm not going to make any apologies for it. And my number 1 is the book through which I discovered PKD and which through most people discover him, and that's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I read this before the film came out. I bought my copy in, I think it was 76, 77. This is my original copy. And I picked it up off a stand in John Menzies' newsagent in where I come from in South Wales. And I looked at it and I thought, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? What a title. That completely blew my mind. I had to read it. I thought, what is this about? And that wonderful cover art really got me as well. Here's an earlier Panther edition. That'll cost you about 25, 30 to 30, 40 quid these days, that one. That's a nice one as well. And I just had to find out what it was about. So this was the one. And I still go back to it on a regular basis. I've read it probably 25 times. I really love this book. I know whole parts of it almost by heart. It never gets old for me. And it's a wonderful, warm book. It's one day in the life of a guy in post-apocalyptic California in the future after World War III. And his job is to hunt down androids which have escaped from colonies and which are a danger to people on Earth. The film Blade Runner is quite different. This has some different messages. There's some of them the same. But it's the richness of the world building, the genius of the characters, the sort of sleights of hand where Dick goes off for an angle and takes you down unexpected routes. And one of those particularly where Deckard, the central character who works effectively for the San Francisco police, where he discovers that there's another police agency, which is entirely ersatz. There's things like that. There's a lot more in this about the environment and animals. There is a secular religion called Mercerism, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful book. And I can't be objective about it. I love it so much. It has been part of my life for such a long time, and will always be so, and I'll always go back to it. If I were objective, there are probably better books by Philip K. Dick. They would be either Ubik or Martian Timeslip, possibly Frolix if I thought about it a bit more. But, you know, I love all his work and it's all worth reading, but there are 12 of the very best for you. So I would say this isn't a bad place to come into PKD. The problem is, of course, is that most people see the film now before they read the book, and their expectations are based on the film. So maybe you should read something else instead. But I love it. I think it's absolutely fantastic. So I hope you've enjoyed that. A populist video, I know. A lot of you watch the channel will have seen these things before, have heard me say some of these things before. But I felt it was a necessary balance up against, you know, the worst of PKD from a while ago. And it's a chance, obviously, to look at some nice books as well. So there we go. What's coming up on the channel? There's going to be a Silverberg video in about a month. I've got something new to say about some of Robert Silverberg's books, which we haven't covered before, and it gives me an excuse to reread them. I'm rereading a lot at the moment, and I keep getting asked about Gene Wolfe. There is going to be a Gene Wolfe video coming out probably in 2 to 3 weeks' time. Next week's video will be a reviews video, just looking at a few things that I've read recently. So there's Silverberg, Gene Wolfe, a reviews video coming up. In the club room, the members area, of course, it's only $4.99 a month still. There's now a backlist. We're getting up to 40 videos. There's book hauls. There's me ranting on. There's some out and about stuff, all sorts of things in there. And that is going from strength to strength and will continue. There's a video every week and it's only $4.99, as I say. And, you know, do sort of like, subscribe, super thanks if you want. All those things are out there. Thanks to everybody who watched the Christopher Priest video last week, which has just had an incredible response, which I'm really sort of touched by, because that's one of my favourite books. And of course, as you know, if you watch the channel, Chris was a friend of mine for many, many years, and I absolutely love that book. It's important. And, you know, Priest was in many ways our homegrown PKD, and more people need to be aware of that. So this is Outlaw Bookseller with Philip K. Dick, Top 12, signing out for now, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.